stopped way too early. Hey, folks, welcome to a new episode of Armed Lutheran Radio, a show about guns, hunting, competitive shooting, the natural right of self-defense, and what God's word says about the issues surrounding gun rights and gun ownership. I am your host, Lloyd Bailey, the Armed Lutheran. This is episode 349, and this is our first ever. Now, we've done live shows before, but this is our first ever Clinging to God and Guns show live, and I am thrilled to be joined by the pistol-packing padre himself, Pastor John Bennett. Pastor, welcome back, and it's good to it's kind of cool to see you live and in person.
Yeah. And if this goes horribly wrong, you can just tell everybody that it was my idea. So
And that and we'll just act like it never happened.
that's right. No, I'm looking forward to this, and yeah, looking forward to possibly ruffling some feathers in this episode.
Let the jimmies be ruffled. That's right. Today we are, for those who don't know what we're talking about, well, obviously you can see the title of the episode is called The Fifth Commandment, but specifically we're talking about some articles that were written in a new annotated large catechism released by Concordia Publishing House. Was it this week or late last week? How long has it been out?
Well, it's been put on hold, though. The release has been put on hold, from
Right.
what I understand. Yeah.
Yeah, but it was when did the leaks of some of the text came out? And
About 10 days ago
about
or
10
so.
days ago. So we'll get into that, and because that's ruffled some feathers in various places, and we thought we would dive into the articles on the Fifth Commandment today. Before we get started, though, I do want to give a big shout out to the members of the Reformation Gun Club who make this show possible. This week's shout out goes out to Frank from Lake City, Michigan, Catherine from Casper, Wyoming, Melvin from Holt, Missouri, Eric from Buckeye, Ohio, Tony from Little Elm, Texas, Stephen from New Bern, North Carolina, John from Spokane, Washington, Vincent from Tulare, California. I think I pronounced that wrong for years. Guillaume from Osage Beach, Missouri, and Calroy from Boron, California. Thank you all so much for your support. As I say every week, and if you have never heard the show before, just to let you know, we are listener funded. We rely on our members, the members of the Reformation Gun Club, to make this show happen every week. And if you would like to find out more, if you would like to support the show, get access to all kinds of cool benefits, and get invitations to our monthly online hangouts like we had a couple of weeks ago, visit armedlutheran.us/gun club, or look for a link in the show notes for this or any of our previous episodes. All right. So, Concordia Publishing House is the publishing arm. Am I correct in this? The publishing arm of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod?
That's what it's supposed to be. And this is where I might ruffle some feathers along the way. I'm not a big fan of CPH.
Okay.
And the reason I'm not a big fan of CPH is because there's been a shift in the last 10, 15, maybe 20 years where CPH operates more as a for-profit corporation than it does as an entity that's supposed to be purely to the service of the church.
Okay.
For example, the ESV Study Bible, it's $60. Okay. It's been out for how many years now, and CPH is still charging
still $60.
$60 for a Bible. Yeah, so there's been other instances where they've threatened legal action against various people. One is somebody that I know personally from seminary who's a missionary in Africa, and he was translating the small catechism into a local dialect, and he got a cease and desist letter.
Oh my.
Yeah, so he basically said, "Oh, I'm just using the Enchiridion version as the basis for," and it was simply because he was using the English text as the basis for the translation. even though you can go to the catechism.cph.org website and view all of this for free. So
Right.
he had to basically say, "Oh, I'm using the Enchiridion version, which is public domain now because it's been out since 1943 or something like that."
Right.
So threatening legal action against a missionary who's translating into the small catechism. Um, there was issues with there's an organization, Confessional Lutheran Education Foundation. They take and translate and publish theological works. They also do hymnals, and they do this in small batches for oftentimes native dialects that CPH, they have this basic practice of not publishing anything that they can't make money off of. And this organization, they publish things at cost for the work of the gospel. And so they were prohibited from translating any hymns that CPH had the rights to. So they had to use public domain hymns. So um, these are, and I'm getting into church politics here, getting into the weeds for some of our listeners who may not be members of a Missouri Synod church. But it frustrates me when your purpose is to provide a service to the church, and yet you have executives that are paid very large salaries, and you operate in some the same manner that many for-profit organizations would. So my personal opinion of CPH is that the organization needs to be restructured and get back to that model of existing for the purpose of creating publications for the church.
Gotcha. Okay. Before this descends into a CPH bashing
Yes,
show,
sorry.
um, in fairness to them, in this particular case, this was a publication that was commissioned by the Synod. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, yeah.
And so the way this typically works, as I understand it, is the Synod commissions something to be published. They send it to CPH. CPH publishes it. They don't review it. They don't approve or deny anything. The doctrinal review is done at the Synod level, right? Is what?
Yes, so doctrinal review is a process, and the um, there's I don't understand exactly how the board works. I believe the CTCR, the Commission on Theology and Church Relations, I believe that they are involved in that to some degree, but it has to go through a doctrinal review process where it has to be reviewed for content to make sure that this is in line with the scriptures, this is in line with the Lutheran confessions, and it would seem that the typical doctrinal review process did not happen the way it's supposed to.
Something broke down somewhere. It
Yes,
would
and
seem, yeah.
I'm going to preface this by saying I'm not in any way going to impugn the character of any of the editors. I'm going to try not to impugn the character of any of the individual essayists. One of the editors, uh, uh, Pastor John Pless, one of my professors from seminary, he's a very solid confessional Lutheran. So I'm hoping that it wasn't just throwing his name on there and not having, I can't see how some of the issues that there are with this edition, some of the essays, how he would have let that slide by. I don't know. It's one of
Yeah,
those things though where one individual reviewing it as opposed to many individuals. And the more that I hear about this and the more that I read it myself, there's a lot of troubling stuff in there.
right. And I've got to wonder if the review process involves sort of splitting it up. Um, is it, all right, we're delegating this part to this person, this part to this person, and that might account for Reverend Pless not seeing some of this stuff, or maybe he's not in tune with some of this language because some of it is very. eh, I could see people who aren't in tune with the culture wars currently and the idea of the battles that we're having in the culture with the idea of wokeness, um, letting some of these things slide because they don't recognize the danger. So I'd be curious to find out more about the process that goes. You know, how do these doctrinal reviews happen? Who's assigned? How are they assigned? Because
Right.
I would hate to, like you say, I would hate to impugn the entire board if they're not all involved in reviewing every single page.
Right. To what extent were, yeah, how much was their input involved in that? Yeah.
Yeah,
It's trying to put the best construction on everything,
yeah.
um, as opposed to the new catechism version of explain everything in the kindest way. I like to put the best construction on everything version a little bit more.
Yeah,
Call me
I
old
like.
fashioned.
Yes, I agree. I like that one myself. Hey, if you are watching, Sparky is with us. Never been on here live. Sparky, welcome. Glad you joined us. If you are watching and if you would like to comment as we go along, be sure to join in. Send us a comment, and we will respond as appropriate. So the complaints about the language in the book sort of bubbled up in social media. First, there was a very long thread in Twitter, and then I saw posts popping up in Facebook. There were snippets that were being provided as examples of the objectionable language. This had, of course, everyone's jimmies rustled because they were presented with no context, and so we thought, and most of the complaints were related to the sixth commandment, as you might expect, with regards to the sins of homosexuality and transgenderism, and even references to pedophilia. There's this ubiquitous sort of use of woke language, especially when it comes to race and things like social justice. Um, but there are also 3 articles that were written on the fifth commandment, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today. And we wanted to see, you know, based on the snippets we saw, that we were concerned, but without full context, as we always say, as pastor, as you say on the show often, and as all of our contributors in to the book Duty to Defend said repeatedly, context is key. So we're going to put these things in context, look at them in their full context, and see, is there any there?
Yes.
Is it overblown hype, or should we really be concerned?
Yeah. Oh, quick note, since you mentioned the essay on social justice,
Mm-hmm.
I was a little concerned when I saw the title. I read the essay though, and it's a pretty good essay.
It
It
is a good
basically
essay.
says just love your neighbor.
Right.
And now, unfortunately, it would have been nice if the essay addressed how the concept of social justice has taken on a very political theme in our country. So,
He
it's
does,
like,
doesn't he talk about how social justice in many ways, in many places and many churches, has replaced the gospel
yes,
itself, which I
yes.
think was very well done.
And basically said that if you're going to preach social justice, it must be in the vehicle of the gospel where the gospel is not perverted.
Right.
That it has to be your concept of social justice is sharing the gospel, the love of Christ Jesus. So
Right. Before
I
we
see
dig
Mark
in.
Sturdivant is watching, one of my
Yeah.
one of not a classmate, but I was with him at Concordia Irvine back in the day. So
Very good.
yeah.
Well, to Drew and Mark, welcome. Glad you're with us. Now, let's see. There are, um, we have, thanks to a source who shall remain nameless, we, you know who you are, and we thank you for providing us with a copy of the annotated large catechism, and we have read through the articles in question, and not just the snippets. So we're going to go through them. There are 3 related to the fifth commandment. I want to just briefly mention the first one because there's really no reason for us to discuss it because it's fantastic.
Yes, it
It
is.
is by Tiffany Manor. It's called legalized murder, and it is specifically how the fifth commandment deals or relates to the question of abortion and assisted suicide, and it is spot on.
Indeed, it is. Yeah.
I want to jump to the third before we jump to the biggie, the one that really has the 2A crowd ruffled. And the reason I want to jump to this third one, it doesn't it doesn't really deal with the Second Amendment and gun rights, but it does touch on some issues that you and I have discussed in previous episodes, namely the issue of racism and policing. It's entitled "Hatred as Murder," and it's by Warren Malueg Lattimore, who, after some researching, I discovered is the pastor at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in New Orleans, Louisiana. He's served there as the sole pastor since 2013. He's apparently president of something called the Black Clergy Caucus, which I didn't even know we had. And the problem that I have right out of the gate with this article, before my warning lights started to go off, the radar went off when I discovered that despite his penchant for quoting Luther, um, I don't get the sense that he's a Lutheran. And the reason I get that feeling is because he's a doctrinal student at Duke Divinity School.
Yeah.
And if you've ever heard me talk about Duke Divinity School, if you don't know anything about it, it is a school it's a far left leaning seminary for Methodist pastors. And my dad taught there for 25 years and was run out of the place because he objected to some of the kinds of social issues that were being taught as things that needed to be addressed, that pastors needed to address from the pulpit. And they basically said, "Hey, how about you just don't come back?"
Yeah.
And that was 20 years ago.
Yes, and that was before the Methodist Church was considered radical. So
Yeah, there were warning signs back then, and I think that was sort of the tipping point where you really saw the church sort of go off the cliff from there at a more rapid pace. And now that the Methodist Church is split specifically over the issue of ordaining gay clergy and trans clergy. Um, so the reason Mr. Lattimore was chosen, I suspect, is a letter that he wrote, and I discovered this with a little bit of research. He wrote in 2020 during the riots following George Floyd, that incident, and in that article, he's complaining that the LCMS is basically turning a blind eye to racial injustice because we're not sufficiently on. We don't have enough black members like there's never been a black president. There's no black members of the Senate advisory boards or the board of directors. There are no Senate black. What's the word I'm looking for? Basically, the hierarchy, the structure
sure.
of the church is not sufficiently woke. And if you read that article, and let me just sort of pop that up here real quick, just to give you an idea, because this article or this letter that he wrote in 2020 is basically the article that he wrote for this catechism. So let me share this right here. So this is an article written in 2020, and he says here, the year is 2020. A few years prior, the last remaining historically black college and university dedicated to training black Lutheran teachers was closed by the Synod. The nation is in unrest. Racial injustice is being protested in a nation that has long denied its existence. Black men and women are being killed by those who have sworn to protect them. And he mentions Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, who was not killed by police.
Right.
David
He was
McAdoo.
killed by a couple of rednecks.
Yes, who were subsequently convicted of murder for it. David McAtee, I'm not familiar with his case. Racial tensions flared into riots. And basically what he's asking is, well, when this stuff happens, who can the inner city Lutheran churches turn to, because there are no black people in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod's hierarchy. There's no synod, black synod or district president. Um, there's no the seminary boards of regents has no black members. There are no black members on the board of directors. So because there are no black people, they we can't understand the struggle. And so he's complaining here about the lack of diversity in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and suggests that we can't really do anything or speak out on the subject of racial injustice, because we're not sufficiently black.
Right. Yeah. And I had completely forgotten about that letter. But now that you've brought it up, I do remember reading that. And the gospel is not about race, the gospel transcends race. We all are created in the image and likeness of God, and yet we are fallen because of the first parents who sinned. And if you are trying to view the church through the lens of race, you have allowed yourself to become more beholden to the culture and to the winds of political change, rather than being beholden solely to the gospel. So, it again, and not to beat a dead horse, but this is about allowing your politics to inform your faith, as opposed to allowing your faith to inform your politics.
Right. And in this article that he's written for in the Large Catechism, it's called "The Fifth Commandment: Hatred as Murder." And what he does here, and in concept, this is not a bad subject to approach. I'm not opposed to this, to the idea of addressing the question of racism as it relates to the Fifth Commandment, right? Because as we're taught in the Bible, if you hate your brother, you've committed murder, essentially, right? So that's the point that he's trying to make here. And that's not a bad one. The problem is that his sole focus is on white racism against blacks,
Right.
instead of the concept of racism in general. Because let's not forget how many acts of racism are racially motivated violence are carried out by blacks against Asians, against Jews, and those things are excused, or the media turns a blind eye to them. But
Right.
whenever a black police officer kills or a white police officer kills a black suspect, then it's automatically because of systemic racism. And that's the point that Reverend Lattimore focuses on here in this
Right.
article. And I think this is a missed opportunity.
It is. It is, because he could have done so much, and yet the topic of racism. You look at the surveys that go back several decades regarding race relations in this country, and the perception is that it's getting worse, not better. You know, we went through the 50s and 60s with all the civil rights movement, and by the 80s, you look at the all these surveys, 80s and 90s, things were considered better than they are right now. Why is this happening? And
Mm-hmm.
it's because of the Marxist ideology of using differences among population groups to create division, and the most easy difference to manipulate is that of race.
Yeah.
So
And I
it's
and I think part of he's twisting, you and I have talked about this many times, the kind of the affirmative side of the fifth commandment, that not only are we not to kill, not to murder, but we are also supposed to protect those that we can protect our neighbor, protect our family members, protect ourselves. um, he takes that concept, the affirmative side of the fifth commandment, and he applies it to basically to Christians in general. And if we don't stand up and we aren't sufficiently down for the struggle, then we have essentially killed George Floyd.
Right.
That's the point he tries to make in this article, which I find personally despicable. I didn't want to get really nasty, but I really don't like this.
No. Well, and a lot of this, you read through the article and it seems like milk toast virtue signaling, but
Yeah,
then you get to footnote number 6 and you realize that, oh, this is political.
yeah. Let me see if I can find
This
that.
isn't theological, this is political.
Yes,
Um,
footnote number 6. He refers to the deaths of a number of unarmed black uppercase B citizens at the hands of white lowercase w individuals or police officers sparked widespread protests and turmoil in the recent years, and especially in 2020. Many churches sought ways to promote racial justice and healing. Now, if you had, where I think he goes wrong with this quote or with this particular footnote, it is a statement of fact that yes, unarmed black citizens died at the hands of white individuals or police officers. That's true. Widespread protests did happen. There was turmoil across the country. Yes, that's true. Many churches did get involved in the social justice movement and try to sort of heal divisions in their communities. That's also true. But his use of the capitalization of the words black and white is straight out of CRT.
yes, it is. Yep.
And I saw it in an article in the New York Times not long ago, maybe yesterday, the exact same thing. If you read the way the left looks at the race issue when they talk about black and white, black is always capitalized, white is always not.
Yeah.
And
I have to wonder, people looking back 100 years from now, will they look at this as the period of American history where it was acceptable to dehumanize a certain group of people on the basis of their skin color, but it just happened to be whites? Um, yeah, and of course, this denies the reality that there's twice as many unarmed white people killed by police than there are unarmed black people.
yep,
So, Daniel Shaver's death, was that about race?
right, right. Or
But yeah, we're told with this most recent uh, beating and subsequent death in Memphis that this is about white racism. And you have these idiots going on TikTok saying, hey, white people, we did this. No, it was because you had some sick, evil guys that did not care about the life of their fellow man.
right, and you've got 5 black officers for those who don't have been living under a rock. You have the beating of Tyree, or I can't remember his name. I apologize for that.
Tyree's his first name, his last name escapes me at the moment.
He was killed in a beating by 5 black police officers. And those have all been subsequently fired and charged with murder. And now I think 3 or 4 more people, including members of the rescue squad, the EMS workers, have been dismissed as well. And yet, with a black victim and black police officers and a black chief of police, we're being told that race is what this was all about,
Right.
because
Right.
these black police officers are promoting systems of white supremacy by being police officers, essentially.
Yeah, these are the same kind of people that call Candace Owens a white supremacist. So,
Yeah, that's true. Good
yeah.
point. So this is the same kind of racist dog whistling. Um, and I just don't think it has any place in the large catechism or in our confessions at all. This is the evidence of the slow march of Marxist thought creeping into the institutions. We've talked about that on the show many times. That, and Black Lives Matter is, as at its core, Marxist,
Yeah, its organizers even admit that hey, we are trained Marxists.
despite the
So,
fact that they used all the money to buy themselves mansions.
right, BLM, buy large mansions. Yeah.
That's right.
Well, and ultimately these issues like race are being used to create division rather than to create unity.
Hmm.
And this was a missed opportunity for fostering a spirit of unity. I mean, you can go out and say, yes, there are people who feel uncomfortable around others on the basis of skin color, and that you can say that that's wrong, that's a discriminatory perspective. But then you can talk about, hey, when seeing other people who look different for you or different from you, see them as someone for whom Christ died. You
Yeah.
know, stop seeing things on drawn along lines of skin color or politics or ideology or whatever it may be, and see that as your fellow human being.
Yeah.
So, yeah, yeah,
If this had been a general um, uh, objection against racism in all its forms, that would have been
right,
perfectly appropriate.
right,
But the focus on the white versus black form of racism and the suggestion of institutional racism and the suggestion that Christians are complicit in the murders of black people if they're not involved, if they don't support Black Lives Matter. That's the implication he's making here, that if we don't act, and he doesn't suggest what acting means, that we are somehow complicit in those killings. That
right.
has no place in this book. And I don't know how it got past doctrinal review. It
I
just
don't
does.
know. I mean, there are some things that if you were to edit this essay, you could take out the objectionable and the subtle stuff that's in there that doesn't belong, and
Hmm.
it actually wouldn't be a terrible essay, but
Right.
it's hard to get past those glaring flaws where it's pretty obvious that he has an axe to grind.
Yes. Yeah. The only kind of racism that it matters is what he defines in the article. The only fifth commandment sin that we're committing is by not being woke enough and supportive of racial justice, um, instead of pointing out racism of all kinds is a sin against God. And so, yeah, I think this should have been cleaned up. And maybe there were objections to it, and some people said, "Well, I don't want to make him mad. We don't want to look like we're the white folks are, cutting out the black guys, the black pastor's article here. I don't want to." Maybe there was some of that. I don't know, but
Well,
this should
here's the
never
question.
have passed doctrinal review in this form.
Yes, and here's the question. This is troubling when you think about it, is that we had the letter that he wrote back in 2020.
Right.
It's a letter that made its way around social media among Lutherans.
Right.
So if we already knew that this is the kind of stuff that he writes, and by we I mean Synod and whoever it is that was in charge of this project, why did they ask this guy to write the article?
You got to wonder if it was appeasement.
I don't know. I don't know. And I'm sure he's a very wonderful guy. Again, I started out by saying I wasn't going to try to break the eighth commandment in any way, but it's important that we allow our politics to be informed by our faith, and this is backwards.
Yeah.
This is about a political movement that is antithetical to the gospel.
Yeah. And his involvement at Duke kind of
Right.
makes sense when you read this and the previous letter.
Because this is very much how do I phrase this properly? Um, this seems more inspired by Black liberation theology than it does by the gospel.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I didn't think of that. That's true.
So, and for those of you who aren't aware of what Black liberation theology is, um, think of that. Who was that senator that got reelected in Georgia? Or I can't think of his name. Or the guy that was Obama's pastor. The not God
Oh,
bless me. Yeah, those
oh,
guys. That's Black liberation theology.
right. Jeremiah Wright
Yes, yes,
and Raphael Warnock.
yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Took me a second. Had to dredge those out of my brain hole. All right, so let's get to the one that really has some Second Amendment advocates their jimmies ruffled or rustled, and that is an article by Joel Bierman, and this is called "Lawful Lethal Force." And let me share this with everyone. Um, there we go. So Joel Bierman is a member of the faculty at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. He has a doctorate in philosophy and a master of divinity from the same. And he starts the article.
He's also a member of the CTCR,
Which is Council on Theology and Church Relations.
Correct.
Okay. So he starts out even before he can offer the most basic explanation for the commandment against killing, Martin Luther first deliberately and pointedly grants two exemptions from the purview of the prohibition: earthly government and God. And this is what he focuses on primarily throughout this article. And it is that God and the government, and he focuses mainly on government, are exempted from the prohibition from killing. That as he says, in other words, the strict and simple fifth commandment that forbids the taking of life applies neither to God nor to government. God, of course, is the author of all the law and subject to no law, so he's free to give and take life as he pleases. Government, Luther insists, is not only bound by the commandment against, is not only not bound, I should say, by the commandment against killing, but is in fact under obligation to do the opposite. Subject to God's law, government must use the sword and, according to the dictates of justice, even take human life as necessary. Now, this is an article that, very similar to the Lattimore article, if you changed it, if you did a little bit of editing, less editing, I think, than the Lattimore article, but still some editing, you could still have something good here. My problem is that my problem with this article is that he tends to tiptoe around the question of self-defense. He talks about vocation. He even refers to natural law, but he never makes that connection between vocation, the vocation of parents and the father in the home, and the natural law part, where part of natural law is basically your right to life and the right to defend your own life. He never makes those connections, and instead focuses basically on whether or not it is okay for you as a Christian to bear the sword so long as you work for the government.
Yeah, and that's he doesn't come out and say it explicitly, but it is strongly implied that he rejects any notion that a Christian has the right to use lethal force in defense of self.
Yeah, he gets kind of close. He gets to he makes a couple of points where you think, okay, he's going to get there, and he doesn't quite. Let me see if I can find it in the.
Where he's talking about vocation, I copied and pasted the.
Yeah, that's where he starts talking about the three estates, which we've discussed on the program, and he talks a little bit about the. Here it is. All human beings. Right. Here it is. In each of these three spheres or estates, talking about the family, the church, and the state, God is at work through his creation, through his chosen instruments, human beings who have been given the authority or office to fulfill the mandate each has received from God. And now he mentions parents, princes, and pastors, respectively. All human beings then live their lives in all three estates, fulfilling the particular tasks each has within that area of responsibility. These translate to the peculiar vocations or callings assigned to each person by virtue of the place given him or her within the creation. Now, he's you could, and we have on the show, made the connection from this to the right to self-defense, right?
Right.
Especially as your responsibility as parent to protect your family, to protect your wife, to protect your children. But he won't go that far. He goes on and talks about the prince's unique vocation, his amt. I'm not sure what this word is. I
It
didn't.
means office.
It means office. I'm not sure what
Yeah.
is that.
Up above in the preceding paragraph,
Is it
the
Latin? What language is this?
Amt is German.
Oh, I should have guessed.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
After all, it is Luther.
Not that I know German, but
But it
it's in
is.
the paragraph, preceding paragraph. He
Ah,
puts the Amt in parentheses after office.
gotcha. His office as the one who bears the sword is in turn imparted to others to assist in that work: soldiers, tax collectors, judges, jailers, executioners. Notice he does not mention the common citizen.
Yeah,
Those who
yeah,
do such work are extensions of the sword of God, enacting his justice. Now, the point that we are not to bear the sword to bring the wrongdoer to justice, because that's not our calling, that's not our vocation, that's not a responsibility that God has given us. He's right in that, but he tiptoes, he sort of sidesteps the question and focuses solely on the role of those who work for the government bearing the sword.
yeah, yeah. And where he really gets at this, though, and the part about vocation that I was talking about, if you go halfway down the next paragraph, um, starting with about the seventh, eighth line down, but it was the brilliance and blessing of Luther to grasp and teach clearly the wonder of the doctrine of vocation, in which a person acts never for self, but for the sake of the neighbor who needs help. When the neighbor needs rescue or protection or justice, the Christian whose vocation includes the sword must use that sword for the neighbor's well being. So, that, and now that I'm reading this the second time through, that almost makes it sound as if the the one whose vocation includes the sword, so only law enforcement must use.
Only soldiers and law enforcement are
Yeah,
authorized to help the neighbor whose life is in jeopardy.
right. And this also, when it says you must never act for self, okay,
Okay,
what's
that
the implication there? That self-defense is prohibited.
right.
So that was,
And he makes that point up here
yeah,
in the previous paragraph as well. The focus on never for self,
right.
never for therefore Christians do not fight for the as individuals or for their own benefit, only as obedient servants of the authorities for under whom they live. Now, that's quoting Luther. Now, yes, this is
But his
Luther's large
application
catechism.
is problematic.
Right, and Luther's large catechism is it's it's obvious why we would quote Luther, but that doesn't mean that Luther's infallible on these issues. And maybe this wasn't the best application of that particular quote. Um, I He's clearly
Well,
uncomfortable.
and hold on just a second. That quote, though, is from Luther's essay, "Whether Soldiers Too Can Be Saved."
Right.
So he's taking that. It's a misapplication. This is where context is key, because he's talking about Christians. Luther's talking about Christian soldiers,
Right.
and then
Right.
he makes a general application here, which
Yes. And then he finishes on, I think it's in the next page. Where is it? Where I don't want to get to this quote yet because this is
next paragraph.
it's down here at the bottom where he says um recognition of legitimate force. But he talks about how maybe it's in the previous page, but he's
It's
talking
right
about,
after footnote number 4.
yeah, but there was one where he's talking about how you as a Christian, you shouldn't feel burdened by conscience if your if your if your job, if your vocation is to bear the
Oh,
sword, right? So he's focusing on soldier and police, just as Luther was, that you shouldn't feel burdened by conscience if you're concerned about bearing the sword as a Christian who is supposed to be promoting peace. There's so the focus throughout this article is on, if you're a member of government, if you're working for the authorities, you can, with good clear conscience, you can carry the sword, you can bear the sword. But he then gets to this, and this is what you were talking about. And he starts to this is where he sort of dips his toe into the sword wielding, the Second Amendment part. This is not to imply that the interface of personal cheek turning and vocational sword wielding is easily navigated and lived. Far from it. Practicing this doctrinal truth in real life can be exceedingly complicated and even painful. And different Christians will certainly reach different conclusions about the best way to sort out the distinction in practice. So this is his first sort of, yeah, Christians have different opinions on these sword things. Let's get back to talking about government.
Yeah.
So then in the next paragraph is that footnote that you're talking about. Finally, the recognition of a legitimate place for the use of the sword within God's plan for his creation is not a license for any Christian to use the sword for any reason unilaterally deemed legitimate and necessary. So, okay, we acknowledge and have acknowledged numerous times, sure, the Bible doesn't say you have to own a gun or you have to own a sword. It kind of leaves the question, and one of the nice things about the Lutheran Church is that we sort of leave that as what is it, adiaphora, where it's for you, it's the freedom of the Christian to decide. It certainly does not provide a scriptural foundation for a right to bear arms. I'm guessing he hasn't read Duty to Defend, but okay.
Right.
Lethal force, Luther consistently taught, is rightly used. Again, he's going back to Luther, but he's not making a biblical case. He is relying on Luther's argument that, and his dissertation on the whether a Christian too can, or a soldier, what is the
Whether
name?
soldiers too can be
Soldiers
saved.
too can be saved.
Yeah.
I was getting them completely.
Which, here's something interesting before you go any further,
Yep.
where he says, Luther consistently taught it's rightly used only in one place by the arm of authority in the state. It is never exercised for the sake of self. So I've got a couple Luther quotes that I just happened to come across in preparation for this.
Oh, goody.
One of them from one of the very essays that Bierman quotes. So, yeah.
Are you able to share? Or are you going to say that?
Oh, I was just going to read them.
Yeah, go right ahead.
All right.
I'll hide this.
Oh, if I click on present, can I actually put stuff in here?
You can actually share it onto the screen.
All right. Okay. Good. Present.
And I
share screen.
I usually choose I do share screen, and I choose window. That way you only get the window of the thing that is.
Oh, it's okay. Oh, select window. Okay, yep. Select window.
We haven't done this before, folks.
Microsoft Word, yes.
Can you tell?
Firefox wants to access this. Okay, there we go. Aha. Later. Okay. All right. Allow. There we go. Is it going to come up here? There we go. Okay.
For some reason, I had to click to add it. But all right.
So you have to pardon my notes. I hadn't typed this up in preparation for everybody to see. Let me make that text a little larger there.
Okay.
There we go. All right. So this, the first quote I have here is to the Saxon princes.
Mhm.
There is this guy, Duke Henry. He was a real jerk. He was trying to use every bit of force that he could to stamp out the Protestant Reformation, even to the point of hiring arsonists to burn down villages.
That
So just
sounds like a joyful guy, just
yeah,
wonderful.
just a real class act. And he was defeated and captured. There was questions as to whether or not he should be released, and Luther basically said, "No, consider this God's providence that this bastard has been captured." He
Oh
didn't use
my.
the word bastard, that was just my word, but, I'm editorializing. Um, so after this defeat of Duke Henry and after his capture, uh, this is I'm gonna highlight here this here. Um, he says, "So now I am saying to our people that they are not to boast of this victory, but give the honor to God and thank and praise Him who alone is the true warrior and is called an almighty man of war who can never fail of victory, as Moses calls him in his song of praise in Exodus 15. Not that one should on that account neglect providing arms, whether one can get them, but that one should not rely on them, which is true. We don't rely on our guns for self defense. We rely on God Almighty. They're just a tool, but only on God who will give the victory either by arms if one can
Either
get
by
them.
arms, right?
Yep.
Yep.
Either by arms if one can get them, or without arms if one cannot get them. Where one can get arms, one should use them as God's gifts, under which he hides himself so as to give us the victory by wondrous means. But where one cannot get arms, God will provide them in abundance to his people in their time of need. So we have nestled in all of this um, Luther's exhortation to acquire arms if you can. This is also, you know, Duke Henry was a person of authority. So we have armed resistance.
He was a head of state.
Yes. And so Luther's making it very clear that self-defense is perfectly permissible.
Mhm.
Um, so next quote. This is to Elector John, March 1530, and I'll bold that to make it a little more obvious here. The legal dictum, and then there was the Latin term in there or German term, I don't remember which, I took it out. One may fight force with force accomplishes nothing here. So he's talking about whether or not it's permissible to take up arms against the emperor,
Mhm.
for it may not be applied to governmental authority. It is even invalid if applied to those of equal standing unless self-defense or protection of others or of subjects demands the use of force.
Hmm.
So,
That oddly contradicts everything that Mr. Bierman has
yes,
written here.
he uses that word Luther consistently. That word consistently doesn't mean what he thinks he means, I guess.
Luther can be taken out of context just like the Bible can.
Yes, yes,
Maybe
and
that's our next book.
maybe, maybe. Um,
And our friend Pastor Drew points out, we don't hold quia subscription to everything written by Luther, obviously, because he wrote some really awful things,
right,
but only the confessions themselves. So Luther's paper on soldiers would not be binding. Yep.
right, right. But yet, since Dr. Bierman, who I'm sure is a very devout and confessional scholar,
Hmm.
he gets this wrong, and he tries to use Luther in support of a prohibition on self-defense, and it's pretty clear that Luther did not believe that and did not teach that. And furthermore, Dr. Bierman also does not rely upon Scripture to support his thesis. So, the last quote, since Dr. Bierman quoted whether soldiers too can be saved, self-defense is a proper ground for fighting out. Keep in mind he's speaking of soldiers in combat, so want to provide that context. And therefore, all laws agree that self defense shall go unpunished, and he who kills another in self defense is innocent in the eyes of all men. Now, even though this is written to soldiers, at the same time, and you'll have to forgive me, I should go back and look a little deeper at the broader context of that quote. It's typically understood that taking life in war is permissible and even required. So I'd have to go back and take another look, but I
Which
would,
is sort of the point that Bierman's making.
yes, but I would venture guess that when Luther writes this, he's not being Captain Obvious, but I believe he's applying this to the individual citizen.
Right, right. Self-defense is not a soldierly military kind of concept. That is, we're talking about the
Right.
individual person
Right.
at
Because
that point.
in combat, it's offensively
Mhm.
engaging in battle for the purpose of prevailing over your enemy, and it's generally understood that that requires taking life. Um, Although if I was a soldier in battle, I'd much rather be killed in modern warfare than ancient warfare because
Yeah.
it might not be the sword that gets you; it could be the gangrene 3 weeks later.
It's the medicine probably. It's the medical treatment that you get afterward, or maybe don't.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and blunt and bladed
Oh,
weapons versus
oh, yeah.
a bullet, you know, quick quick versus
Give me the
long.
bullet any day of the week.
Yeah. Yes.
Uh, here's that footnote that you were talking about, from Bierman's article. It should be apparent that this is a conclusion reached on the basis of theological considerations. Is it? The Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, of course, does articulate such a right, and while not offering a rationale, the implicit foundation, it doesn't offer, the Constitution doesn't offer a rationale for the right to bear arms. I think it does.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's in the Federalist Papers if you really need the fuller rationale that, yeah,
But
there's
even in the clear text, 27 words of the amendment, it makes the rationale is the um is
it's
the
for the freedom of the state more or less, and the state meaning the people.
right, the proper training of a militia, which was the people, is only to be accomplished if everyone has a right to bear arms. And so that the rationale for the Second Amendment was the maintenance of a well-regulated, a well-trained, a proficient militia, a proficient citizenry that could assist the
Yeah.
government in times of war.
Well, and the rationale, it's right in there. It says being necessary to the security of a free
Of a free
state.
state. Yep. Yep.
So, yeah, but
But it says,
again, he's trying to say that this is a theological consideration, but he doesn't provide any sound theological proof for his article, for
well,
his
then
thesis.
he goes on to suggest that the rationale for the implicit foundation, the rationale for the Second Amendment and the right to keep and bear arms is the exercise of reason and the ideals of the Enlightenment. Working within the appropriate temporal realm, parameters of reason, and shaped by their confessions of faith, serious and faithful Christians may come to quite divergent conclusions regarding the Second Amendment and the attendant questions touching on gun control policies and legislation. Such differences are neither surprising nor cause for alarm and merely indicate the latitude that must exist as people of faith strive to discern how best to extend God's rule over his creation. Now, to some extent, I agree there because this is something that should be left to the freedom of the Christian, as we said earlier. But the problem is when you start talking, but that freedom really should be, do I own a gun or not?
Right.
Not you shouldn't own a gun, but
Right.
I don't want to own a gun. It's okay if you have one, but I don't want one. That's the freedom of the Christian. The
Right.
freedom of the Christian doesn't come in when you start saying you cannot own that gun. because it's not safe.
Well, and even his premise that the Second Amendment is, the foundation is the exercise of reason and the ideals of the Enlightenment. No, the Second Amendment, and it makes it very clear, was all about the fact that they had just beat the crap out of the redcoats, and the only way they were able to do that is because they had guns.
Yeah. Yep. That you needed a proficient citizenry to help protect the country and to
Yeah,
protect other citizens. Yeah.
the I mean, there may be elements within the Constitution, and certainly there's individual writings of some of the nation's founders that they certainly were influenced by Enlightenment, but I'm pretty dang sure the Second Amendment and Enlightenment didn't go hand in hand.
Right. Right. Um, yeah. There's clearly this conclusion reached on the basis of theological considerations. I think is quite misleading. I think
It
it's
might well, it's his theological considerations.
That's yes, and see, that's where I think we have a little bit of a problem here, and this is where the doctrinal review failed, because I think in the case of these 2 articles that we reviewed here tonight, the individuals' um, theological conclusions are what are being put forward, and they're being put forward as explanations or expansions on the large catechism, which they're not.
Right.
They're the opinions of the authors of these 2 articles.
Yes, they're taking personal opinion and treating it as if it were fact.
Yeah. Yeah, and with the exception of the article about abortion, which I think is thoroughly, well written and steeped in our faith and our understanding of God's creation. These are the and are backed up by our theology and our doctrine. These are not. These are
Right.
opinion pieces. And I think and we haven't even looked at the stuff on the sixth commandment, and I just wonder how much worse it gets if these 2, which you would think with the fifth commandment should be pretty innocuous. It should be pretty straightforward. You don't hate people, you don't kill people, right? You
Right.
you don't kill the unborn, you don't kill the elderly,
And you come to the aid of those in need.
and you come to the aid of those in need. But here we have opinions on that are divergent from those core principles that are political in nature. How much worse would the stuff about sexuality be when we start talking about the sixth commandment? And how
Yeah.
much worse could it be when we start talking ninth and 10th commandments, when we start talking maybe about income I haven't looked at them, so I don't know, but are we going to start talking income inequality
Equal
and
pay.
equal pay and all of that kind of stuff?
Yeah.
I don't know what else is in here because we've only focused on these things that are important to this show, but I'm concerned because if we went this far off the rails with these 2 articles, I worry there's a lot worse in other places in those
Right.
annotations.
Well,
And
and it's unfortunate because there's some stuff that's really good, and then you come across these things, and the stuff that's bad is pretty bad.
it's bad enough to get the whole project scuttled.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that they either scuttle the whole thing, which CPH wants to make money, so I don't know if that's gonna happen.
But but I
But,
don't think they want the negative press that's
no, because
resulted from this, so I suspect that and that makes you wonder too if your suggestion about the sort of profitability concerns of CPH, if they weren't sort of, complicit in that, "Hey, President Harrison, how about y'all pull this and review it because we're getting hammered."
right. Well, and here's my big concern. is that looking at the questionable content of this collection of essays, that this has the potential of dividing the synod.
Yes,
People may think that's crazy, but you've had synods
we've
have
seen
divisions over far less.
we've seen it before.
And so it's my my hope and my prayer is that this collection of essays, that the bad will be omitted or replaced with quality theologically sound articles, um,
Yeah.
or just or
This
just bend the whole darn thing.
the simplest thing, and especially if you're worried, if the Senate is worried about the time and the money that's been invested so far, the simplest thing might be to just remove the objectionable content.
Right.
Stick with the stuff that is solid theologically based, and keep and then go forward. And then maybe consider including more annotations in a future edition, but I just can't see going forward with this in the current condition that it's in.
Well, and the article, hatred as murder, if that one is omitted or edited or changed, I bet my lunch money that a public stink is going to be made of it, and this is going to be labeled as racism and all that kind of stuff. So,
Yeah, there's those considerations too. That's true. If I mean they better cut more than just Lattimore's article.
right,
Otherwise, even if they do cut more, like you said, there's likely to be the insinuation that it was removed simply because a bunch of white guys at the synod wanted to get rid of it, or
right.
were a little too upset about being called out on their racism. Yeah, I don't know where this goes from here, and all we can do is pray that whatever does happen, it's the right thing, and pray for President Harrison and those who are involved in whatever review takes place. All right. Well, I think that probably does it. That is, I think we've covered as much as we can cover here. Yeah, there is a there from what we've seen. It is in context. It's not pretty. Um, and President Harrison was right to pull it. And all
Right.
who, as far as the Fifth Commandment stuff goes, yes, there's where there's smoke, there's fire, and those who were raising the alarm based on the snippets were right. There's there and worse.
Right, right. And what's unfortunate is that you've had people pick sides with this argument, and there's guys that I know and respect, that are basically, decrying the criticism as unchristian behavior without having read the questionable material. So, I was more or less trying to stay as neutral as possible until I saw the actual content, and it's troubling at the least. Where the Missouri Synod is better than this. They need to do better than this and
Yeah.
publish something that's theologically sound.
Well, Mia has joined, is watching, and commented that now she needs to figure out what happened to President Harrison. President Harrison is safe and sound, but he has recalled the this annotated large catechism that was just released about 10 days ago, and he is recommending further doctrinal review before the project goes forward. So
I feel
um,
like sending him a bottle of whiskey as medicine for the headache that he's taken on with this whole thing.
he deserves it. Yeah, I can't imagine. He's probably taking arrows from all sides at this point.
Right. Yeah. And it's, sometimes the most memorable lessons in life are the most painful. And hopefully this will be a painful enough um, experience that the synod does not repeat these kinds of mistakes, where we thoroughly vet authors and review content before we publish it. Even, and it wasn't officially published, There was just the electronic version that was distributed for review more or less. Even before you reach that state, this stuff needs to be thoroughly reviewed before it's leaked out for public consumption.
Well, now the Senate needs to review its review process on top of, I mean, it's not
Yeah.
just a problem with this publication. The question is, how did it get to this point with, if it did go through doctrinal review, how did it manage to get published? If
Right.
if that indicates there's a problem with the review process. And I think some transparency on how that works would be helpful as well.
Yeah. Did the review process only include selected excerpts, or was the entire content word for word reviewed? And
And
not
was
that you have to go through the large catechism itself, you can just have the text stand on its own. It's the essays.
It's the essays. And did every member of the review board review every article that was submitted, or were they parceled out to different members of the board? And yeah, I reviewed mine, they're good. I reviewed mine, they're good. And then you put it all together and you got a crap sandwich.
Right. And you know how it goes with the crap sandwich, you all have to take a bite. And that's kind of what we're dealing with now.
That is kind of what we're dealing with now. All right. Well, folks, if you have any comments or any questions about what you heard here today, if you enjoyed seeing this, our mugs live and in person, we this has been fun. I want to do, like I said at the beginning of the year, I want to do this more often. We talked about it a little bit last year, and I'm glad we're finally doing it. I'm looking forward to doing it again. And folks, if you have questions or comments or complaints about anything we said, if we ruffled any jimmies, visit the feedback page, armedlutheran.us/feedback. Leave us a voicemail or a voice message. We'd love to hear from you and respond in a future episode. Next week, who knows what we'll be doing for episode 350, but whatever it is, it'll be fun. Thanks, Pastor, for doing this.
Absolutely.
This was a lot of fun. And thank you all for listening. And for those of you who commented, Drew and Mia and Sparky, and who was with Drew, Mark, who was with Drew watching. Thank you guys for contributing to the show as well. And tune in again next week. Until we talk again, see you again, you see us, whatever. Keep shooting, keep praying. We'll talk to you next time.